In this guide, we're going to be checking out all of those enemy types and bosses in Silent Hill F. Foggy streets, check. Creepy monsters, check. The actual town of Silent Hill? Not exactly. We've somehow wound up in a rural Japanese town in the 1960s, and this time we're following the dark journey of a high school student called Hinako, who's battling her internal struggles, which have manifested into all the typical sort of freaks you'd expect them to in a Silent Hill game, which in traditional fashion are subject to getting bonked on the head with a metal pipe. As always when it comes to Silent Hill, you can expect this guide to get pretty damn deep with all the symbolic stuff, and I'm going to run over all the different enemy types first and then cover all the bosses a little bit later on in the video. So we've seen spicy flesh mannequins in the past Silent Hill games, and this one's certainly not shying away from them either. The most common enemy type you'll find stumbling around the town's dense fog is the Kashimashi. Basically a living dummy, made from chopped up body parts all sewn back together, looking like the sort of thing you'd expect to find in Ed Gein's basement. In a similar way to Frankenstein's monster, these things sort of look like they've been assembled by a creator. They've become a product of society that's been manufactured to look and act in a specific way. Unlike nowadays, where everyone's brainwashed by influencers to do the same sort of thing, societal norms were mainly built on tradition in the past, putting pressure on young people to follow fixed expectations. And these butchered doll women are probably manifestations of that same societal pressure put on Hinako, along with the fear of becoming objectified by her future husband, denied of having any self-expression. The Kashimashi look very feminine, but they're also covered in cuts and wounds, hiding their pain behind a creepy ass smile. A forced smile which is permanently carved into their cheeks. If it wasn't obvious by the massive knives they carry around, they're out to inflict a bit of pain themselves, which is typically what Silent Hill monsters like to do. It's no surprise how they're going to use them, though having that distorted doll-like body makes the creature's movements very jerky and unpredictable, with them quite literally bending over backwards to try and slice you up. All those red spider lilies popping up everywhere might seem nice and pretty on the face of it, but it's probably no coincidence that they're heavily tied with death and departure in Japanese culture. As everywhere gradually becomes suffocated by this corruption, and the whole place starts to look a little bit like 2005's War of the Worlds, new monsters can be generated from the bulging lumps of biomatter formed all over the walls and floor, a prime example of this being the Ara-Abare, which is basically a giant pissed off meat raspberry. Definitely not the sort of thing you want to be stuck in a confined space with, as it's not only going to be swinging around an absolutely massive blade that wouldn't look too out of place in one of the Monster Hunter games, but it's also got a big fleshy tentacle to latch onto its prey with too. The Ara-Abare is basically the embodiment of rage and aggression, represented by its chaotic temperament and its floral blood red coloration, probably derived from the anger Hinako felt towards her for trying to defy cultural standards and wanting to be different to everyone else. It might be a big dopey monster that doesn't seem to be in much of a hurry, but as you might expect, looking at the size of that bloody knife, it is capable of doing some pretty nasty damage. It's also got an annoying habit of screaming in your face to try and throw you off balance, and to make matters worse, it's practically unkillable. So you're generally best luring these things away from wherever you need to be, and keep your fingers crossed that it's not too close to catching you up. Because Silent Hill F takes place in a rural setting with loads of big sprawling rice paddies nearby, it'd make perfect sense to throw a few spooky scarecrow monsters into the mix. The Ayakakashi sort of look like crucified marionettes which have taken the form of the school's students. They eerily stand around, gazing into the unknown like strung up corpses, suddenly coming to life whenever they get the urge to. If there's any birds brave enough to eat the crops on these fields, then they've got some pretty big balls. When you think about it, scarecrows have a sole purpose, and that's to work alone in the fields isolated from society. These things could imply that a lot of the children in the town only really exist to help support their families, represented as puppet-like creatures being tied up with ropes, suggesting that they're bound to the lives that they're born into. And the fact that they're clutching onto sickles sort of plays into this notion too, with the sickle also being a symbol for manual work and peasantry. Depressing backstory aside, the Ayakakashi act a bit differently to most of the other monsters in the town, being much more deceptive creatures, often choosing to creep up on their victims whenever they've got their backs turned. Let them get too close, and you can probably guess what happens next. That sickle's not just there for decoration. It's worth pointing out that not all of these things are completely evil, with many of them being neutral and some of them even choosing to guide you forwards to the next area, sort of reflecting the individuality of the students, all having a mind of their own. Some of them are nice, but some of them are dicks. Despite looking like it's had a bit of a rough time with the Cordyceps virus, the Irohihi is basically a big monkey pervert that should probably be on some sort of watch list. This monster's name is a bit of a mashup of two different meanings, one being a folklore baboon creature, and the other being linked to a dirty old man. Hinako's got a lot of distrust for the older blokes in town, down to the way some of them treat their wives and other women, and this resentment has manifested into a physical form, which is sort of like an ugly pot-bellied ape monster with an uncontrollable lust for vulnerable women, and probably 10 pints of cheap beer. Their entire design and behaviour is centred around forceful domination, Hinako's fear of being trapped in an abusive marriage, and just the general unease of being objectified, with the creature slapping its victims around, grabbing hold of them, and essentially trying to lick them to death in a very pervy sort of way. Not just with that nasty tongue dangling from its gob, but also with a few sneaky ones that like to slither their way out of the palms of its hands too. Pretty gross. There's no question that these guys are the arseholes of the game, not just because of what they represent, but because they're going to pop out to harass you with a barrage of very annoying attacks. They're quick, fidgety buggers, and they'll probably test your patience more than you'll probably want them to, especially when they become enraged and start glowing their heads off like a fibre optic Christmas tree. The last monster might have had some pretty disgusting motives, but our next one is just a bloody disgusting thing all around. Creatures that like to puke everywhere aren't exactly rarities in the survival horror genre, and we can safely assume that these Corruptor monsters in Silent Hill F are a product of the floral biomass spreading all around the town, kinda similar to the Ara-Abare, growing out of a human body and morphing it into a wiggly, squishy pile of wandering flesh, with a bunch of random heads just casually poking their way out of its gooey core. If you've got a keen eye, then you might have noticed that the creepy faces bulging out of the monster's body all look a bit like adult faces, possibly implying that Hinako's fed up of all the adults in the town constantly giving her crap. Once again, linking in with the whole societal expectation thing and the adults' toxic culture being enforced on their youth, but also the violent oppression against their youth who haven't been given a chance to voice their own opinions. This toxic energy is literally fired out of the creature in streams of gloopy blood, hitting you over range while the monster aimlessly plods around in the distance like a bit of a mindless idiot, often choosing to spray its blood soup all over the floor to form nasty puddles of harmful tendrils, making it a hell of a lot more hazardous to try and approach and take on, with all those vines latching onto your ankles and holding you down. This forces you to time your dodges carefully and be ready at all times to retreat to a safe distance, whenever you get the feeling it's about to spew its guts. So the Silent Hill games are known for plunging our unfortunate protagonists into psychological hell, often whisking them off to a mysterious mirror dimension called the Otherworld. But this time around, whenever Hinako gets knocked unconscious, she'll be sent to a supernatural dreamlike realm known as the Dark Shrine, where we'll be greeted by a whole bunch of other freaky monsters with similarities to the ones found in the foggy, plant-riddled town. One of the most common monsters you'll find in the Dark Shrine is the Harai Katashiro, which is sorta like this place's equivalent to the Kashimashi, another creepy mannequin-style creature which dances around the room like some kind of jerky puppet ballerina, being very light on its toes, largely helped out by the fact that its legs have been replaced by a pair of razor-sharp knives. Not exactly great news for us. Well, this creature's also armed with a samurai sword as well, just to make this stabby bitch even more stabby, but at least she's gonna give you a nice friendly smile while she's hacking the living crap out of you. Harai Katashiro's name sort of alludes to it being a supernatural entity, which makes pretty good sense for an enemy found in the Dark Shrine, being linked to human-shaped dolls, often used in rituals to transfer sins and impurities during exorcisms, sort of acting like a vessel to house unwanted spirits, which is later thrown into the ocean to discard all the evil within. Because there's a lot of themes in Silent Hill F about progression and abandonment, whether that be the town's change in religion, or the obvious one, transitioning from childhood to adulthood, well, this definitely plays into the idea of something being cast away, possibly even being a nod to Hinako's identity being discarded too. Symbolism stuff aside though, you can expect these things to be a bit sneakier than normal, often prone to conducting surprise attacks by jumping out of dark corners and dropping down from the ceiling to ambush you unexpectedly, which, combined with all those blades and acrobatic moves, generally makes them trickier enemies to deal with than their Fogtown counterparts. Silent Hill F's Dark Shrine is home to its own twisted variants of monsters you'll find in the Fogtown, and those pervy monkey bastards with the big tongues also have their own Dark Shrine equivalent too, in the form of a faceless, mutilated creature in shackles known as the Kamugara, which crawls around on all fours and generally mopes around in the pitch-black darkness. We can see that these things are creatures born to be punished. They're wrapped up in chains, imprisoned by locks, and maimed to the point where they've become numb to their own reality. It's not only missing its face, stripping away its identity, but it's also got a huge gaping hole in its chest too, a hole where its heart should probably be. This gives off the impression that they're enslaved and condemned to suffer a life they obviously don't want to lead. It all sounds pretty miserable. But this could once again symbolize the societal expectations in 1960s Japan, only flipped around to show the men's side of the story this time around. Pressured to follow a traditional patriarchy and having to put up with all the stresses and responsibilities that come with that. Because they've got no eyes, the Kamugara is not going to be able to see anything, but they've acquired a very acute sense of hearing to make up for their lack of sight, often stopping to listen out for any sudden movements, only to come scrambling over with their arms swinging around if they suspect that someone might be close by. Definitely something you'll want to be cautious around. They might be blind, but that's not going to stop them from trying to knock your bloody head off, turning into absolute savages if they've been alerted by your presence. I guess it was only a matter of time before we bumped into a monster made of creepy toy dolls. The Omoi is kinda similar to those blood-spewing freaks in the Fogtown, being a creature that's built from a mound of many faces. In this case, made from a collection of plastic dolly heads and limbs all tangled up in a pretty disturbing mess. You can interpret the symbolism here in a few different ways. The Omoi, being comprised of toys typically used by little girls, is likely a warped representation of Hinako's youth being left behind, along with the corrupted innocence of maturing into an adult, especially as she struggles so much with letting go of her past, often using nostalgia as a comfort barrier to try and cope with the loss of her childhood identity. But this freaky thing is probably connected to her anxiety of becoming a mother as well, in the not too distant future. The Omoi casually skips around like a playful child one minute, and then the next it's down on its knees throwing a little tantrum, usually heard making some demonic crying noises to suggest it's desperate for some parental attention. Well, you're certainly going to give it some attention as you whack the little bugger around with your weapons, though you're going to have to be wary of it screeching into the air to generate harmful sound waves, breaking your flow of combat. They're not exactly the hardest enemies in the world to deal with, but they still do a pretty good job of causing some disruption and chaos, just like an unruly kid that's choosing to be a little shit. After spending a fair bit of time wandering around in the Dark Shrine, you'll eventually bump into an alternate version of the Ara-Abare. Another beefy mass of flowers and biomatter, with this thing being stuffed with a load of giant taiko drums, seen shoved in its mouth and bulging under its rotted skin. This guy is definitely looking a bit more miserable than its brightly coloured Fogtown counterpart, as the plants on its body all seem to be dying and it generally looks like it's rotting away and decomposing. Not to mention the fact that it's also wrapped up in ropes and covered in ceremonial objects too, which probably links in with the whole theme of being tied down to tradition, quite literally in this case. Aside from doing all the basic stompy stuff that big monsters like to do, and slamming its spiky stick around in a very erratic way, this thing's also going to beat its drums to conduct other nearby monsters in the vicinity, which will follow its orders like puppets and go on to attack in a much more aggressive manner. The relevance of having a big taiko drum shoved in this thing's gob is likely down to these instruments being used during religious ceremonies in Japanese culture, but they're also known to be used in warfare as well, to direct troops and give them orders, and to intimidate the opposition, with their loud ominous booming sounds intensifying the fear factor. This all plays into the idea of the monster being a commanding and domineering presence, once again linking in with Hinako's fate being imposed by tradition. So another really nasty creature riddled with symbolism is basically a giant pile of swollen pregnant bellies. Obviously this thing's got heavy connections with Hinako's thoughts about motherhood, along with the fear of being reduced to a birthing factory whose sole purpose in life is just to bear children and continue a bloodline. But you could also say that it represents a lot more than just that too, tying into the whole notion of being trapped in a laborious marriage. If you look very closely, this thing actually looks like two monsters fused together, one resembling a faceless pregnant woman giving birth on her back, and the other being a crouching dude carrying the rest of the monster's hefty weight on its shoulders, possibly representing the husband in the marriage having to put up with the pressures of supporting his wife and family. They're conjoined in an uncomfortable, unnatural looking way, merged together in a single form which sacrifices their original identities for the sake of being united together, ultimately becoming a grotesque mess of a creature that hobbles around the place plopping out meatballs everywhere. These fleshy monster eggs will eventually hatch if you don't destroy them in time, spawning other enemy types into the scene to make the fight even more chaotic. Though these birthing monsters don't exactly have a whole bunch of different ways to take you on themselves, mainly spitting out harmful phlegm at you over distance, throwing a weight around to squish you into the floor, but mostly relying on their minions to do the dirty work for them, while they just creep around the room soaking up a butt ton of damage with their tanky bodies. Although you'll find quite a few of these in the Dark Shrine, you'll later run into them in the Fogtown too, albeit different variants that look like they've been damaged and corrupted by the town's sinister aura. Aside from being covered in cuts and flowers, having some funky tentacle hair, and generally looking like a bunch of messed up grapes that really need chucking in the bin, these things do a very similar sort of thing to their Dark Shrine counterparts, apart from the fact that these monsters also like to give birth to some blue eggs, alongside the normal ones, which act like proximity bombs that detonate if you get too close. Probably worth pointing out that these variants do seem to have a slightly feistier attitude overall, being prone to having violent outbursts and wailing to create disruptive shockwaves. You'll still have to do a fair bit of egg smashing too, though because the blue ones don't actually hatch, they shouldn't really cause you too many problems. Providing you don't let them blow up in your face, that is. Anyway, that's all the monsters done and dusted, and with that, it's time to check out the bosses. There's actually quite a few of them in this game, and pretty much all of them tie into the main story, so you can expect there to be quite a few spoilers coming up, as those big words on the screen might suggest. So the first main boss in Silent Hill F actually comes in the form of a very twisted looking shrine maiden. One of Hineko's closest friends, Sakuko, is a very spiritual character whose family actually manages a local Shinto shrine, and this ghostly creature is basically a harsh representation of her, having the same sort of hairstyle and similar voice, but obviously given the full-on Silent Hill treatment here too, sort of looking like a dug-up corpse with a weird centipede jaw. This kinda links in with the fact that Sakuko is a corpse, or at least she is metaphorically in Hineko's messed up mind, and she's being portrayed here through this demonic looking entity, wearing ceremonial robes, a sun halo to reflect her devotion to the Shinto gods, and there's also a big keyhole shaped opening punched right through the monster's chest too, possibly hinting at Sakuko's underlying neurodivergence being locked away inside, making her feel insecure and trapped. It's all up to interpretation, but putting all the symbolic stuff to one side, it's probably obvious how this thing's going to attack us. That massive spiky club's not exactly there to be used as a back scratcher. You can expect a lot of this fight to be melee based, with the monster doing its best to slap you around with that deadly club, and because it's on a long metal chain, well, that means it can be thrown over distance too. So just because you're a few steps back from the boss doesn't exactly put you in a nice safe spot. In the second phase of the fight, she'll start phasing around the arena only to pop up in random places and charge up a new powerful pulse attack. Once you've found her in the thick fog though, you're best interrupting this by smacking her around while that attack's winding up. Otherwise, be prepared to be hit by some sort of spiritual blast, unleashed by the boss's mace. So Hineko's got a few interesting childhood friends, and along with Sakuko, she also hangs around with a fairly questionable character called Rinko, who's kinda got a crush on the guy they all hang around with called Shu. Hineko's known Shu from an early age, and they've both got a pretty close bond together. But because Rinko senses a bit of a love triangle thing going on between them all, she's done the typical immature teenager thing and developed a bitchy attitude towards Hineko, consumed by a burning jealousy that's been bubbling away over time like a scorching pot of lava. Well, that fiery temperament is definitely expressed in one of the monsters you'll find in the Dark Shrine, being the resentful embodiment of Rinko, popping up as one of the game's mainline bosses. It's taken the form of a head priestess, donning a long scraggly coat and pointy hat, a holier-than-thou sort of figure representing Rinko's superiority complex, and it's hard not to notice the fact that her face has melted off too, creating a big searing cavity slap bang in the middle. A clear representation of Rinko's hatred and envy, turning her into an unrecognisable monster blinded by rage. Although this boss generally likes to swing its staff around and whip you about with a bunch of chains up close, it's also going to do a lot of flame-based attacks too, by throwing lines of fireballs in your direction and causing molten plumes to violently shoot out from the floor, generally spending big chunks of the fight acting like some sort of inferno conjuring wizard from a wacky fantasy RPG. The boss has also got other devious tricks to try and catch you out too, and that's the ability to summon a bunch of creepy melting puppet minions with loads of eyes into the scene, which all eerily pace around the fiery arena to awkwardly stare you out during battle. Well, up until they suddenly get ignited by the boss, causing them to come charging over to self-destruct. An attack which might be there to symbolise Rinko's unhinged thoughts suddenly being expressed towards Hineko in vicious outbursts. After spending a large portion of the game cutting ties with her past and metaphorically killing off the people she once cared the most for, I suppose it's only right for Hineko to pay her parents a visit too. You'll eventually make your way back home and discover that it's not exactly the same place anymore. It's here where you'll be able to find Hineko's mother and father waiting for your return. But unsurprisingly, just like the house, things have taken a bit of a weird shift with them too, with them welcoming you back with a rotten banquet of whatever the hell that is. It doesn't take long until the parents start morphing into twisted abominations, with the dad transforming into a big pissed off plant blob, basically a different variant of the Ara-Abare, while the mum turns into a flowered covered knife wielded lunatic, blinded by a mask of plants, which probably symbolises her ignorance to her husband's abusive behaviour. You basically got two bosses to contend with here, with the father being the main aggressor, constantly charging over with that big ass blade swinging around, while the mother assists him by lobbing knives over distance and occasionally dashing over to go a bit slash happy herself, which sorta ties into the way Hinako sees them both in reality. Basically a bad guy supported by his compliant servant. As far as boss fights go in this game, it's not exactly the most dynamic one in the world, especially considering you've already encountered enemies like this before. But you've still got to pay close attention to them both at the same time and do a bit more multitasking than some of the other bosses. So we're on to the final bosses. Yep, you heard that right, bosses. As there's 4 different fights which play out in 4 of the game's alternate endings. So obviously some of the upcoming spoilers are going to be some pretty big whoppers. Before we jump headfirst into the game's final boss fight, I should probably give a bit of context as to what it is and where it actually came from in the first place. The underlying story of the whole game is basically about Hinako cutting off her friends and family as she moves towards an arranged marriage organised by her father, basically treated like a transaction to pay off the family debts. It's a story about being conflicted between 2 different mindsets, whether to submit to what society expects or whether to resist it to gain the freedom of choice. This is reflected by the Dark Shrine, a place where Hinako goes in her mind where she slowly accepts the dark reality of being married off unwillingly, guided by a mysterious fox mask wearing guy called Kotayuki and directed towards the idea of becoming his wife. The more invested Hinako becomes with the fox mask dude, then the more she loses her own identity, being encouraged to sacrifice her past, becoming colder and less compassionate about doing so along the way. Even choosing to replace parts of herself through a bunch of gory purification rituals, quite literally being moulded to become an extension of her future husband, hence why she's got the whole Sonic the Werehog thing going on. It's not because she's turned it into a furry, but it's because this Dark Shrine version of Hinako has become so blinded and enchanted by Kotayuki's presence that she's now choosing to accept her fateful marriage, ultimately transforming into a big nasty monster. A faceless creature wearing a traditional headdress, albeit a bloody massive one, along with a Shinto wedding outfit called the Shiromuku, which is where this thing gets its name from. This monster version of Hinako has been seen several times throughout the game, destroying the town, killing its loved ones, and essentially trying to wipe the slate clean of its past. But it hasn't been able to successfully get rid of the original version of Hinako, which represents the doubtful part in her mind that wants to reject the marriage and make her own choices. Fast forward to the end of the game, and both versions are finally pitted against each other. A final battle of inner turmoil between 2 contrasting dispositions. Because we've already technically been in the boss's shoes, we should have a decent idea on how she's going to attack us, lashing out with that oversized Yeti arm and spending most of her time trying to claw us to death in closer ranges. But as we've seen elsewhere in the game, this monster can also corrupt its surroundings with blood-red vines. And it's not going to shy away from using those same tricks here either, generating puddles of supernatural plant matter which forces you to pay very close attention to where you're stepping in the arena. But shit gets a lot more real when Shiromuku manages to grow another big fox arm, really enhancing those powers and giving the monster another limb to slap you around with too. Concentration is key here, as those attacks are definitely going to get ramped up a few notches. But so long as you keep on chipping away at its health and avoid getting battered yourself, you'll eventually be able to overcome Shiromuku and play the game all over again to duke it out with the next endgame boss in New Game Plus. In Japanese folklore, there's some pretty wild stories about bog-standard household items becoming possessed by spirits once they've reached 100 years old. These spirits are known as the Tsukumogami, and they were worshipped by a lot of the town's residents in Silent Hill F who followed the Tsukumogami faith. But many of them later chose to abandon this religion to follow the Inari faith instead, hence why there's loads of little shrines with foxes all over the place. And this led to conflicted religious views in the town on which gods to actually believe in. This idea of having rival gods is made relative to Hinako's situation too, with the newer Inari faith being represented by Kotayuki, the fox mask guy, while the older Tsukumogami faith is represented as Hinako's longtime friend Shu, being left behind and forgotten. In this specific ending, Hinako has chosen to side with Kotayuki, but before you feel bad for Shu, he's not exactly been completely honest with you, introducing Hinako to those psychoactive red capsules to try and warp her mind and sabotage the marriage. A pretty badass looking god pops out from the darkness to take control of Shu, possessing him like a Tsukumogami spirit would to an old discarded object. And it's probably obvious what comes next, especially with this thing holding onto all those brutal weapons. This deity-like creature's got a lot of faces, and it's also got quite a lot of spiky things to stab you with as well, which is where a good majority of its attacks are going to come from, especially towards the start of the fight. But eventually, Tsukumogami will get a bit bored of slashing away at you in close range, and so it won't be long until it starts showing off those godly powers too. teleporting around the place while trying to avoid being slapped around by Hinako's arm, giving the boss a great opportunity to bombard you with loads of different projectile attacks from a safe distance, from light arrows, wave blasts, and a bunch of other stuff that you'll need to dodge as you try and rush forwards to close the gap. It's all got a bit of a God of War vibe to it, and it's another fight that spans over multiple phases. Though towards the latter end of the fight, Tsukumogami is going to start phasing around the arena even more, charging up shockwaves by jingling his little glowy bell. So there's quite a lot of things that might catch you out in this fight, especially with the boss being able to hit you with punishing moves over pretty much all ranges. So this leads me over to the third final boss fight after another round of New Game Plus. By following set requirements to get the alternate ending called The Fox Wets Its Tail, you'll once again wind up in the Dark Shrine having a big showdown with Shiromuku, the original final boss of the game. But you'll be interrupted by Kotayuki not too long after, who's not exactly thrilled that you're trying to resist the marriage by beating up your submitting faceless counterpart. In comes Shu to the rescue, who cracks Mr. Foxface over the head with his baseball bat, with this being the ending where Hinako chooses to run away with Shu instead of becoming a bride, despite the fact that he's technically a sneaky drug pusher. Well, Kotayuki's not exactly thrilled with you doing that either, and he'll basically transform into a big fox monster called Shichibi, a red kitsune with 7 flowing tails, eerie glowing eyes, and a very pissed off looking fox face. Well, this is probably the closest you're going to get to a Pokemon battle in a Silent Hill game. Shichibi's going to do all the sort of stuff you'd expect a giant fox god thing to do, jumping around, lashing out with its claws, jabbing you with its many tails, and lunging over distance with all those gnashing teeth. But it's also going to pull a bunch of other devious supernatural tricks out of the bag here too. Tricks involving environmental hazards, like one that causes a bunch of blood tendrils to come shooting out from the floor. He's also going to revert back to his human form at certain moments to do the typical thing that bosses like to do when they can't be arsed fighting anymore, where he sits back in a little protective bubble and summons a bunch of shadow minions to fight on his behalf, which take the form of some of the enemies encountered throughout the game. You can expect those attack combos to get more aggressive as the fight rages on, and you'll also probably notice that his red fur will slowly become more golden as he shifts between the different stages too, giving you a nice little indication on the fight's overall progress. So we're finally onto the final boss of the final bosses. If you manage to get through yet another New Game Plus playthrough and meet all the set requirements to trigger the Ebisoga in Silence ending, then you'll be treated to a different yet familiar fight involving several different bosses. There's a lot of complex supernatural storytelling in this ending, revealing Hinako to be some sort of chosen one with divine power, which is sought after by Kotayuki's clan, hence why she was targeted for marriage in the first place. But the general gist of this ending involves both versions of Hinako joining forces and fighting off their predetermined fates. Dark Shrine Hinako goes up against a black nine-tailed fox monster called Kyubi, which sort of represents Kotayuki's ancestral clan leaders, while the normal Hinako goes up against another Kusumogami creature, only with this one being bound to her childhood doll instead of Shu. This basically plays out as 2 different boss fights rolled into one, though you can expect both of the boss's movesets to be pretty much the same as they were in the other endings, only with the added twist of the fight literally flip-flopping around between each phase, forcing you to adapt to an ever-evolving battle and giving you twice as many attack patterns to try and remember all at once. You should probably already have a good idea on what to expect if you've completed the other endings, but obviously expect it to be a lot more chaotic considering there's essentially 6 phases to deal with here. But once you smack your way through them all, this story path ultimately ends with Hinako destroying tradition, thus being given the choice to decide her own fate for herself. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video and want to see all the enemies and bosses in Silent Hill 2, then that video should be up on the screen for you to click on right now. Though if you'd rather check out my entire horror game playlist, covering the monsters in loads of other games, then feel free to browse through those videos instead. Very big thanks to all my channel members for the support, and a very big thanks for watching the video to the end.